You'll turn in your Bibles with me to Matthew chapter 16. That's where we will have our sermon today. Now, it seems strange that we're in Matthew when we're doing a sermon series on Genesis. We've been going through the book of Genesis, and so you may say, well, why in the world are we in Matthew if we're going on a sermon series walking through Genesis? Well, that's because we have hit Genesis chapter 3. That's the part Evelyn read from Genesis earlier. And Genesis 3, those first 7 verses have so much packed into them, so much implication, that I feel like we need to examine some of these pieces before we actually dive into the chapter itself. So last week we took a look at Satan, at the devil, the serpent that's there in the scene of the Garden of Eden. And this week we take a look at the nature of temptation itself. Now, Jesus is God who became human, and he was tempted in every, scriptures say he's tempted in every way like we are, yet without sin. Jesus never sinned, but he was tempted. He was tempted in the wilderness immediately after his baptism. That's probably the most famous of the temptations. But I think that what is perhaps an even more difficult temptation for Jesus to resist is this one that we'll read about here today in Matthew 16. And by looking at it, hopefully we'll get a look at the nature of temptation. So join me. We'll begin in the 21st verse. Matthew 16, starting in verse 21. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the hands of the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed and raised up on the third day. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord, this shall never happen to you. Let's stop there for a minute. This should be stunning to you, that Peter has the nerve to pull Jesus aside and rebuke Jesus. And it should be particularly stunning because if you're reading through the Gospel of Matthew, just immediately before this scene, we see Jesus ask Peter, who am I, essentially? And Peter gets it right. He says, Jesus, you're the Christ. You're the Messiah. You're the fulfillment. You're everything we've been waiting for. And then in the next breath, he has the nerve to pull the Messiah aside and say, no, you've got it wrong. You can't go to be crucified. And what gives Peter such nerve to be able to pull Jesus aside and make this stunning rebuke? Well, I think we have to look at the content of what Jesus says. Jesus informs his disciples he's going to Jerusalem. He's going to be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. He's going to be killed. And then the third day, he's going to rise from the dead. You know what Jesus just did there? He preached the gospel to his disciples. He preached the gospel. He said, I'm going to be crucified, and the third day I'm going to be raised from the dead. This is good news. And yet the disciples don't receive it that way, especially not Peter. Why doesn't Peter receive this gospel that Jesus is going to be crucified and raised from the dead on the third day? Why doesn't he receive it as good news? Because he can't hear past the cross. He can't hear past the cross. I think he just turned his ears off when he heard Jesus say, I'm going to go and be killed. And then he said, no. Peter stopped listening at that point. And he was so hung up on the cross that he felt he needed to pull Jesus aside and say, no, Lord, this will never happen to you. And here in this saying is where the temptation of Jesus lies. What Peter offers Jesus is a way for him to be Lord without the cross. Peter says, we will follow you, Lord, but this can't happen to you. And he's probably right that the disciples would have followed Jesus full well, and he would be then their Lord without the cross. And the temptation is that Jesus has the opportunity then to avoid the pain of the cross. And I contend this, that what lies in every single temptation is the opportunity either to gain pleasure or to avoid pain. That's every temptation. It's not always physical. Sometimes it's mental pleasure or pain. But every temptation is either to gain pleasure or avoid pain. That's in there. Now, I'm not saying that gaining pleasure or avoiding pain is in and of itself bad. It's not necessarily bad to have pleasure or avoid pain. But it is whenever we take it above the will of God. And that's what I think we're seeing. Jesus offered this temptation to be Lord without the cross, to avoid the pain. We'll see why Peter, we continue to see why Peter made such a harsh rebuke in verse 23 then. We go on. He, that is Jesus, turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are not setting your mind on God's interests, but on man's." So here we see Peter give Jesus a rebuke, and now we see Jesus return the favor, don't we? A very strong rebuke. This is one of his closest friends, and he says, "Get behind me, Satan." He calls him Satan. "Get behind me, Satan. You're setting your mind on the things of man, not the things of God." And why did Jesus give such a rebuke? Well, we see that he's tempted. Jesus admits it himself. He says, "You're being a stumbling block to me." Peter has offered Jesus a temptation here, and he recognizes it right off the bat, and he rebukes it with the strongest, most unqualified term, "Get behind me, Satan." And why would he do this? Because Jesus has his mind set on something other than gaining pleasure and avoiding pain. In Isaiah, we hear the will of God in Isaiah 53 concerning the cross. And Jesus certainly would be familiar with this, the words of God, the will of God. Isaiah 53 verse 5 says, "But he was pierced through for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The chastening for our well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging we are healed." Here's the will of God, that Christ would go to the cross. We go further in verse 10. "But the Lord was pleased to crush him, putting him to grief. If he would render himself as a guilt offering, he would see his offspring. He will prolong his days." Hear the good part of this? He will see his offspring. He will prolong his days, and the good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. It comes as a result of him being crushed at the cross. It's the will of God that this redemption happens as it goes through the cross. And Jesus has his mind set on the things of God. And here comes Peter. And what does Peter offer him? A way to gain pleasure, a way to avoid pain. It's at the root of this temptation for Jesus. Jesus rightly says, "You've had your mind set not on God's interest, but on man's." And that's, I think, why we see this severe rebuke. Now, verse 24, Jesus then turns to address us as well. "Then Jesus says to his disciples, 'If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me.'" This is a really simple question. What do you want? What do you want? The word here in Greek is, if anyone wants, it comes from thelos. It means, what do you want? What do you wish? What's your will? So the question is to you, what do you want? Do you want the pleasures of this world? Do you want to pursue those pleasures and avoid the pain? Do you want the American dream of being able to lift yourself up by your bootstraps and put yourself in such a comfortable position and have that money to pass on to your kids and live the life just like every American dreams? Is that what you want? If so, it is. It is what you want. Or do you want to follow Jesus? Do you want to walk willingly into the suffering that he calls us to? In some ways, this is the worst recruiting strategy ever, isn't it? Come, take up your cross, deny yourself, follow me. But here he says, if you want me, if you want to follow me more, then take up your cross, then deny yourself. And what does Jesus have to offer us in exchange for this suffering, for this cross? If that were it, if Jesus' whole command ended right there at verse 24, come take up your cross and follow me, and that's it, there's nothing in it, I'm not sure I'd be a follower. But it goes on. It continues. Listen to what he says, what you gain in exchange for following Jesus. Verse 25 and 26. "For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul?" So what does Jesus have to offer in exchange for taking up our cross? Well, we profit our own soul. We gain our own soul. We get our life. It's not, the Christian walk, I think, is sometimes mischaracterized as you have to give up everything and you don't get anything. You're just these prudish old upset Christians who have to follow a bunch of rules. That's not what Jesus offers here, though, is it? He offers us life. He offers us our soul, the thing that we've been longing for our whole lives to know who we are, the thing that we can't find in all the pleasures of this world and all the pain that we avoid. We still have this hole and we say, who am I? Ultimately, at the end of the day, where am I going? What's the point of all this? Jesus says, if you want it, come follow me. Give up everything and come follow me. And make no mistake, what he says in verse 24 is true. It will cost you everything. No longer will your money be yours. No longer will your family be yours. No longer will your time be yours. No longer will your life be yours. You don't get to decide how to spend your money anymore when you follow Jesus. Jesus gets to decide. You don't get to decide how to take care of your family when they live, when they die. Those things aren't in your control anymore. They belong to Jesus. It's his call. You don't get to decide how you're going to spend the rest of your day. Jesus gets to decide that. You don't get to decide where you live, where you die, what you do. When you lay down your life, take up your cross, everything belongs to him. And what do you get in exchange for laying down your life? Well, you gain God. God who is the source of all riches. God who brings life out of death. God who is the fountain of unimaginable pleasures. You get God. Above all, fellowship with this God when you follow Jesus. When you put it in those terms, it's no sacrifice at all. I lay it down. I follow Christ. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and to forfeit his soul? Jesus is making this great offer. Give it all up. Come and follow me, and you gain God. And he is good, and he's worth every bit of it. But the heart of temptation is this. The heart of temptation wants to obscure that great offer and say, it's not worth it. God's not worth it. That's at the root of every single temptation, for us to say, I'd rather have what this world can give me than God. And we all, as Matthew pointed out, we all fall. We all fall into temptation. We are tempted. We're weak in the flesh, and Adam did too. We'll see that next week when we go back into Genesis and we see that Adam and Eve fall into sin. And where they have failed, though, where they have fallen into temptation, for us and for our sakes, Christ does not. In this moment, he sets his mind on the cross so that the knowledge of good and evil that was taken from that ancient tree, we might find ourselves restored when our Christ is hung on this tree. When we put our faith in him, when we're willing to take up our cross and follow him, we find that life was lost so long ago. May this word be to the glory of God and for the joy of his people.